Okay, do I have the go-ahead to start? Sure. Okay, hi all. I'm Lauren Reese. I direct the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. I'm going to play traffic cop in the conversation today, but this is a great one. The focus is climate resilience to strengthen our security, impacts of global climate change on national security, and we're going to hear about some recent climate risk assessments, especially in the context of Germany, a new national interdisciplinary climate risk assessment that was developed by the German Federal Intelligence Service in partnership with scientific institutions. But we're going to first hear from Holger Klitzing, who is the head of the Climate Security Division of the German Federal Foreign Office. He's going to provide some opening remarks to set the foundation for the discussion, and then I'll introduce our panel.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this conference. After all, it's my division head is behind organizing this one. So we're very glad that we could provide once more this platform for this interdisciplinary exchange, which is so important, given that common challenge. I mean, the State Secretary highlighted this morning that we're in a turbulent area, that we need to tackle climate change, that we need to deal with many conflicts, that we have the imperative of cooperation to safeguard multilateralism and all this in geopolitically turbulent times, and that security, freedom, and prosperity are the values that orient our work. But that's, of course, not only something that we want to secure for Germany, but we want other countries and partners to enjoy as well. And for that reason, collaboration is of the essence, in particular when we want to integrate the various strands and bridge the gaps between various silos, be it humanitarian aid, be it stabilization efforts, or be it climate action. And in particular, we need to make sure that our security thinking is informed by the climate discourse, and at the same time we need to make sure that our climate discourse is informed by security thinking as well. That's the times we are living in, and this is why this conversation is so crucial. I venture to say that Germany has been one of the pioneers to try to integrate climate and security thinking and efforts into its foreign policy. We've done that early on when we were elected member of the UN Security Council, and we want to do so again in the future, as the State Secretary confirmed. And our national security strategy set the tone. Also in this regard, those of you who are not familiar with it may outline briefly that it rests on three pillars: classic defensiveness, but also resilience and sustainability. And of course, climate action is part of and parcel of that approach. And the security strategy, which is from 2023, then tasked the intelligence service and also our ministry and Ministry of Defense to come up with an assessment how climate change impacts our security. And that's what the NICE, as we briefly call it, is all about, the National Interdisciplinary Climate Risk Assessment. I have more copies in my office, so whoever wants one is welcome to approach me later. And this is about finding out how climate change impacts the various strands of our security, including, of course, energy security, including human security, including military security, etc. I mean, the findings are clear. Anyone thinking about security needs to think about climate change as well. And the president of the intelligence service put it very aptly, ranking climate change among the top 5 security threats to Germany. I think this is a remarkable conclusion, next to an aggressive Russia and assertive China, cyber challenges, and the fifth one is international terrorism. So climate is there. The urgency, I think, is obvious. Those of you who are familiar with the climate discourse, I don't need to outline the effects of climate change, the frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters, etc., that impact livelihoods and stability and economic well-being in so many ways and in so many places. And so the Nike has been an attempt to put all these aspects together in order to mainstream this thinking, if you will. And so I'm very glad that we have one of the authors here with us who will present more details of the study. And I'm very glad that we can discuss the conclusions and what you make out of the findings, or where you think the next steps should be taken. From our point of view, it is now time to take it to the international level, maybe also to the European level, to see how we can work together, because many of the things identified here certainly affect all of us in the same way. That's not a German specialty. And so, of course, the answers need to be joint answers, need to be collective answers. And yeah, once more, thank you very much for coming, joining this important discussion, and I'm looking quite forward to it.
Thank you. I've been coming to this conference since its first year, and I have to say that, especially coming from the US, the consistency of support from the German government on this agenda has been a critical part of really elevating the conversation across the globe, right? So thank you for that support and for hosting us all today. So now we're gonna hear from Benjamin Pohl, who is the head of climate diplomacy and the security program at adelphi. He's gonna walk us through the findings of the report, which I wanted to say, you mentioned that climate was recognized as among the top 5 security threats to Germany, but having an assessment like this really provides color to what that means, right? And understanding and being able to sort of talk specifics is so critical to really driving that, like, the sort of level of change and investment that we need. And so these types of assessments can really help illustrate specific pathways. So we're going to hear about some of those pathways from Ben, and then we'll hear from Matthew Hudson, who is the Director of Climate Diplomacy in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and has produced a similar assessment, not similar, but a climate security assessment that he'll be able to maybe sort of reflecting on Germany's findings. And then finally, we'll hear from Ambassador Anthony Agatha. How do you say your last name, Ambassador? I'm sorry.
Tony is fine.
Okay.
Agatha.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
It's Hungarian.
Okay, that's great. Who's the Special Envoy for Climate and Environment with the European External Action Service. But Ben, I'll turn it over to you first.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lauren. So essentially, the question that was put to us was, we realize climate change is bad in many ways, but how exactly does it affect our national security? And it's not so straightforward, both because many of the impacts are indirect and the impact chains are fairly complex, but also because it's simply unprecedented, at least in sort of the historic times, right? And so there is a broad agreement that environmental change presents big risks. So even this year, with all the wars that are ongoing, 5 of the top 10 medium-term risks identified by the World Economic Forum were environmental. So there clearly is this strong awareness, but then what exactly this means and what to do about this, that's a little less clear, and that's where this tasking from the national security strategy for this assessment came from. What does the assessment say? I'm not going to go through the book-length version, but there are copies. Apparently, the Foreign Office is still hawking some copies. I don't have any left, but it's also on the website, so you can find it online. But essentially, it structures the security risks emanating from climate change into 3 categories. Right, the first are the direct climate impacts in our country and neighboring countries. Then, secondly, it's the impacts elsewhere in the world that have direct implications for us. And then third, and again, last but not least, the indirect impacts that may not come back to us directly, but that essentially undermine the global system. Now, the first category, the direct impacts, we can already see them, even though we tend to forget after disasters for some reason. We know that they will become worse, and the bill for extreme weather-related disasters in Germany for the first 2 decades of the century was summed up to about 145 billion euros. So it's a huge sum, even though this does not include many of the calculation does not include many of the indirect effects. It also means an average of 1,400 climate-related deaths per year, most of them heat-related, and obviously we are all aware that Germany is not the country that's most exposed to heat waves, so these impacts are even harder elsewhere. But that's kind of very well known and very well documented, that first category. So more of a focus than in the assessment is on the second and third category. And the second category is what do the climate change impacts that happen somewhere else in the world, what do they mean for our security? And that's harder to measure because what we reap is essentially the interaction effects between different systems, natural systems, so the climate impacts, and then governance systems. How do we organize our trade system? How do we organize our food security, and so on? But that difficulty in attribution, of course, doesn't make it less important. It just makes it harder to prove, and it makes it easier to have, to challenge and to maybe also have disinformation as we heard in the last session. So when we, for example, comes to the increasing risks to food security as a consequence of extreme weather events interacting with governance challenges, we know that food insecurity is a key driver of instability in many countries. And so the consequences of food insecurity will affect us, even if maybe the EU can protect its own citizens. And we know that the climate signal impacts are going to be much enhanced, that the likelihood of severe water scarcity across the major bread baskets is about tripling. That depends on the scenario across the century. So we know we will have these big impacts on global food markets. What we don't know in all details is what's going to happen then. But of course, what happened at the beginning of the century, what happened around the sort of Arab Spring, and what this has entailed, we have witnessed. And of course, many of the drivers of this, it was not only climate change, and that's very important to emphasize, but that doesn't mean that we can disregard climate change, because it was the interaction between environmental change and the governance systems that led to the consequences. And that brings me sort of to the third level of analysis, the really indirect and system feedback effects. And there's quite a lot of them in the assessment, and I'll only focus on just one here, which is sort of the increasing delegitimization of the global governance system, right? Because if climate policy remains at the global level obviously insufficiently ambitious, there is a risk that the obvious injustice of these climate impacts, which, as we heard again today, hit the more vulnerable countries much harder, and those who have contributed much less hit them harder. That undermines the legitimacy of the global order. And we can see, of course, that what an undermining of the global order and the norms that underpin it, what this means in terms of consequences. And I think what many people don't realize is how much sort of our business model relies on a degree of global stability. And now that we see, if you undermine a norm, say like arbitrary trade barriers, or you collapsing norms around not changing borders by force, the costs of this we are only just beginning to see, and the costs of this uncertainty are tremendous, and climate change will in many ways likely entail such costs. And maybe just on the last point, and it was something that came out very strongly in the earlier NATO meeting in Montreal earlier this month. There was a presentation by the Ukrainian chief negotiator in the UNFCCC, which just showed in in great detail and greater eloquence than I would be able to. But you know, how the Russian onslaught in Ukraine is more or less directly fossil fueled. And you know, many fossil fuel rents, even beyond Russia, of course, have been reinvested into foreign policies that have been inimical to German European interests. So, in terms of the key takeaways of the assessment, the overarching conclusion is already out here. Anyone thinking about security needs to think about the climate as well. But maybe 3 points to emphasize. The first, as I've already tried to indicate, is that we need to be careful not to look at the security risks of the climate crisis too narrowly in terms of only the direct impacts that we can sort of 100% clearly attribute to climate change, because we need to understand that there are many other global and transboundary impacts that are hard to foresee in their interaction effects, but that will have big consequences for us. And then maybe moving a little bit away from the doom and gloom, the complexity of these risks also means that there's lots of entry points for mitigating them, because we can, you know, mitigate climate change, we can adapt to it, we can adapt livelihood strategies, we can work on the impacts it has on social and economic status, on the political conflicts, and potentially also the violences that follows. And maybe last point, the focus of the report is on the risks as per its mandate, but there is also significant opportunities in the transition, especially if you compare it to what would happen under business as usual scenario. Right? So first of all, the cost of limiting these emissions is far smaller than the damages they will cause. And I mean, just as an example, the last IPCC report estimated that the benefits of lower air pollution alone from the emissions reductions has a similar and possibly greater order of magnitude than the costs of reducing emissions. So just one single health benefit already, weighs up the costs. We can also we can see that the markets of the future will be green. It's just a question how quickly we're going to be there, and sort of moving early will improve our relative position in these markets. And whereas we can see that the declining dependence on fossil fuels will bring some risks for those countries that are very dependent on this, for Europe, it should bring overall geopolitical gains, right? Because we're shifting resources away from the fossil fuel exporters, many of which pursue these foreign policies that we don't particularly appreciate, and we shift these resources to ourselves, right? So why the key point being why there might be, and there will always be important policy trade-offs, there is no fundamental conflict of goals, right? Sort of whether it's about containing the climate crisis or containing hostile powers in the region, the fundamental environmental, economic, and security trends align. And I'll stop here.
And I'd be curious it's a very different geography and economy. What kind of similarities and differences have come out of your assessment?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. Well, first of all, just let me say thank you very much for having us. International cooperation on dealing with this common challenge is so important, and I think it's telling that it's now business as usual for Australian diplomats to be attending this conference. So, like Germany, Australia has just released an integrated national climate risk assessment. It's the first one that we've done, using Ben's excellent steps 1, 2, and 3. This one probably does step 1 in more detail and a bit of step 2, with step 2 and 3 to follow. But it's the first integrated assessment of escalating risks and impacts of climate change. It's based on the best available science. It was compiled by the Australian Climate Service, drawing on input from all across Australian government. And it looked how climate change is expected to impact key systems fundamental to our national well-being under scenarios of 1.5, 2 degrees and 3 degrees of global warming. So it was done in 2 stages. The first stage looked at 56 individual risks and 7 additional risks for First Nations communities. And then the second pass, which became the risk assessment, focused on 11 priority risks and how they impacted those 8 key systems, including critical infrastructure, the economy, health, defence and security. And the key findings of the report are bleak. I mean, it's stuff that everyone in this room will already know, but confronting for a domestic audience. Just to run through a few, the headline point was that climate hazards will be cascading, compounding and concurrent, i.e. they will get worse. One impact will escalate and accelerate another impact, and concurrent is that they will happen at the same time. All of these risks are now interconnected. We will see them in increased intensity and frequency, and they will hit people and geographies that have not experienced them before. They will have significant impacts on the economy, on health, on the environment, on infrastructure. And the numbers are really quite significant. Ben, you were talking about the costs involved. I mean, housing and infrastructure will become uninsurable. By 2050, 1.5 million Australians will be living in coastal inundation and erosion zones. So, this is not just a phenomenon happening abroad or in our region. This is a phenomenon happening at home in Australia. And the report does take a reasonably expansive view on climate risks to defence and national security. So, the totality of things happening, deteriorating geostrategic environment, particularly in our region, acceleration of major climate events in Australia and the region, and the continued reliance on defence for disaster relief really risks overwhelming government and the military's primary objective of defending Australia. So, against that backdrop, there's two key points I'd like to make from a security perspective. And the first of these is the obvious conclusion of this report is without dramatic action to develop resilience and adaptation, Australia will be weaker and more vulnerable as a result of worsening climate impacts. And then the second point, which picks up very nicely on where Germany's risk assessment went, is there is an explicit acknowledgement in the risk assessment that it is incomplete without a clear understanding of the climate impacts on our region, on our trading partners and on our key strategic relationships. Which is quite a telling statement. I mean, it is an acknowledgement that our economy, our society, our national security and general conditions for prosperity are now so deeply enmeshed in the world that we can't begin to plan and prepare for the risks that we'll see without understanding the range of complex and interrelated impacts that we'll see. So what we do about it is the difficult thing, and we were talking with our German colleagues yesterday. We're at a similar stage. I mean, we now have the information, but what do we do with it? How do we take this forward? So the effort to build resilience will obviously begin at home. So at the same time as releasing the National Climate Risk Assessment, the government released Australia's first National Adaptation Plan, which responds specifically to the findings of the risk assessment. It is, generally speaking, a framework to drive prioritised adaptation, action at a national scale, but it is a framework, and there is much more work to do. I mean, just quickly, the security implications of climate are slowly being mainstreamed across government. So the 2024 National Defence Strategy adopted by the Australian government recognises climate change as a national security issue, and the 2023 Defence Strategic Review similarly acknowledged climate change as a threat multiplier. But I think the point that I'll leave for now, but we can perhaps come back to, which is an interesting sort of quirk of Australia's geographic position, is that our resilience depends on the world, and actually the very sharp strategic circumstances which we're seeing in our region are perhaps driving even more adventurous and ambitious action on the climate security front than they are at home. But maybe we can come back to that.
Great. Okay, thank you. Tony, over to you. Any reflections on the two remarks that we've just heard, but also picking up that question of what do we do about it? Yeah. I mean, I think, well, and also in the context of, like, so these assessments are so valuable, right? But they're only valuable as far as they take you. And so sort of thinking about how do you plan for uncertainty and, like, build that into government structures. But then also how do you, and maybe I'm asking this from the perspective of the US, in terms of, like, how do you build it in so that it doesn't totally get undone when the next government comes into power, right? So, like, how do we sort of politics-proof yeah, I know, I'm sorry. But like, I think this is really important, right? Because part of the challenge of it is not just in the US, but globally, you see pushback and sort of efforts forward and then blowback. And so is there a way that we can build some of the scaffolding so that there's resilience in the responses as well?
As an unelected, faceless, technocratic bureaucrat, I would be the last one to say that I would devise policy that would be inoculated against democracy. I just think I understand exactly where you're coming from, but for the legitimacy of everything we do, it's so important that the constituents, the citizens, continue to support it. That's why this morning I said in another, and I have to, somewhere there, I have to avoid repeating myself, that as we're spending a lot of money into defense, it is so incumbent upon that investment that it delivers dividends for the citizens beyond just the security, because otherwise there will not be legitimacy or support for continuing defense spending, which we will need. But it's not a cop-out. I just wanted to nuance that. So first of all, I think this is a very, very influential and important report. I also think that this morning I spoke about the wave, that you need a wave to surf. You can have a great surfboard, you can be athletic, you have balance. If the wave's not there, you're just floating. But there is a wave now, but I think we're at the beginning of the wave. So this is a super important beginning because it starts raising awareness from an unsuspect corner. And that suddenly interests policymakers, then coming, as I said, for me with polka dots tie instead of a general with stars and stripes. So I think these things are super important. Now, when it comes to, and those who were in Montreal, I used this, there was a defense memo asked by Rumsfeld, which is declassified, sent to Bush. And Rumsfeld then asked one of his people, said, can you tell me what the big vital risks are to the US for the next decade? And he got back a one-pager. And the first line was, if you're a British security officer in 1900, you eye your French rival warily. Years later, you're in coalition against Germany. In 1920, the war is over, and you are in a naval battle with your erstwhile allies, US and Japan. 1930, suddenly the Depression struck. 1940, Second World War breaks out. 1950, UK lost its empire. 1960, suddenly Vietnam is in there. So he went on and on until 4 months before 9/11. And he said, I don't know what the next decade will bring, but we have to be prepared. So the first thing I wanted to say is, we're terribly bad at predicting. So let's not pretend that we know what's going to happen. However, it is imperative that we have the imagination to think, but what could happen? And that's what this is doing. So the failure of imagination leads us to actually almost plan for things to come to the fore. So we need the imagination to say, so what happens if AMOC turns around? What does that mean for our temperature? It's going to be pretty cold here. We can't deal with that. What happens if there is a nuclear exchange between two nuclear powers because a water treaty is not being held up, because water is such a basic instance, or in Africa? So we have to be able to imagine that and prepare accordingly. I said we're at the beginning of the wave. In the EU, we had, before the second mandate, after the European parliamentary elections, an Inisto report from Finland, which basically said, there's so much coming at us at this moment. We're having more history than we can consume in terms of cyber threats, demographic, economics, weather threats, geopolitics. And that kind of pushed a preparedness strategy. So in March, we delivered a preparedness strategy with a lot of action points, all, again, cross-sectoral, all of the above. We have to prepare for it. Things that will come out of that is an EU risk and threat assessment. We already had our climate and risk assessment last year, which showed for the first time the cost of inaction. I really like what you said, because whenever I encounter a journalist or others, they tell me, listen, Tony, the transition is so expensive. And I say, yeah, but those are investments. But the cost of not acting are insurmountable. So let's not pretend that if we do nothing, everything will stay the same. It's changing before our eyes. So I think that is so important to bring to the fore. Again, bring the facts to the people, show them that, imagine what a better future could look out. And then to the global governance point, which I think is also very salient at the moment. We see we're moving away from one order. I wouldn't say we're in a new order. I say it's fraying and fragmenting at the moment. Everyone's hedging. We don't know where this will end. The EU, we strongly believe also our viability is tied up with it in a multilateral rule of law, because it's the best of all the worst systems to have. And so we will continue to do that. But that is a threat, because all those vulnerabilities in our society, this digital dependence we have, if somehow there's an electromagnetic explosion and all the digital falls out and we cannot call each other and we don't have the pigeons anymore, we're basically bombed back into 300 years. Hunger is 3 meals away when the fridge doesn't work. If somebody poisons our water supplies. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities in our system, and we have to have the imagination that it could be targeted, not just because climate change or environmental degradation, but because rogue actors might not have any reticence to use that. So we're entering a new age. Unfortunately, I have 4 kids. I don't like this to say it. But we have to have the imagination, and we have to have the wherewithal to explain to our constituents that we need to prepare, that it will cost money. But at the same time, if we would do it in such a way that it gives a little bit more comfort, if the innovation and competitiveness part of that is there, we can make some win-win situations.
That's great, thank you. And I agree. I think that your point this morning about like a false choice, right, is a good starting point. And the point about imagination, I think one of the, maybe next year at the meeting here, we could include more of like the tech sector, right? Because I think there are, and other constituencies of course too, but I think that there are, it would be really interesting to have unexpected voices in the room, and that's where we really need to be able to go and have those conversations and build that shared language. Holger, do you have any reflections on what you've heard here, or sort of from this perspective of where you're sitting in terms of how the risk assessment can be taken forward, next steps? And not to put you on the spot, but
well, taking it forward, this conversation is definitely part of it. So I think one angle, I hinted at it early on, is to find partners to look at it together and see where the shared threats, the shared threat assessment, where the synergies to take it on. I mean, natural partners in that regard are other EU member states, obviously, because they're pretty much in the same boat as we are, but we share similarities to some extent, even with partners as far as Australia. So that is definitely something to go. And I agree with what you said. We need to find and highlight the opportunities. And I think it's very legitimate if people or countries don't go about climate action for climate protection's sake. It's about diversification, it's about jobs, it's about whatever, driving their own economic development, as long as they do it. And I think if we find the common ground there, we'll improve their well-being, international security, and our own well-being, and that's where we need to find the actionable points. I mean, that's easy to be said in theory. In practice, it's more difficult, but I would say we need to basically try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone because we have limited resources.
thank you. Ben, coming back to you, this is a space that you've been working in for some time. First of all, were there any surprises, I would ask, in the assessment? And secondly, what do you see as next steps?
It's a good question. Were there any surprises for the authors? I don't think there were surprises, but I think what was surprising in a way while working on it was sort of the realization that, of course, many of these arguments had been out there, had been made, maybe had not been collated into that. There was a sort of importance of stressing sort of the tail end of the climate impacts, right? We very often, and of course you know about it because we've worked on it together. We've looked a lot at so how does climate change undermine stability, and had put out reports on this. But the sort of the important stuff was right, and not so much the climate signal, but then why would we need to care about instability somewhere else? And I guess this speaks a little bit to the times we are in, where there is a sort of a strain of thought of, Fortress Europe or wherever. We can just, like, if there's, if terrible things happen, they've always happened, we can just put up the, we build a wall and it's fine. We exit from wherever we are in and we isolate ourselves. And that part of the argument that, that it needs to be made, again, is kind of new for me. When I went to university longer ago, then I thought it was like everyone was like, globalization is unstoppable and it's just happening, and everyone believed in this, and now suddenly it's that belief system is gone. So I think making that part of the argument and showing how no man is an island, that we actually are in it together, and making that communications effort much more forcefully, and not just from our side, but also from the broader security sector, was sort of maybe not surprised, but it came as a surprise. Yes. In terms of next steps, I think there's various ways in which this can be, right? I mean, one thing is it's a book, but if you it actually takes probably less than 2 hours to read through. And of course, that also means that many really complex issues are then reduced to like 1 or 2 paragraphs to sort of, build that overarching narrative. And of course, there's many parts in there that really would need drilling down. Not because it has never been done, but because, it needs to be done in a demand-led way, right? So if there's this assessment speaks to a multitude of actors in Germany and also in Europe about these risks. But then on the response side, of course, we already have a lot of policies and regulations and investments that are important in countering these risks. But for each of the institutions that's responsible for managing, they sort of need to drill deeper and see, so where are the gaps in these response mechanisms? What is it that we need to do? And no one assessment can cover this unless you do an IPCC report of 4,000 pages, and even that one doesn't cover it all, right? So what I hope for is that people do have a look at this and discover sort of from their angle, so what's my task here, or what's my risk, what do I need to think about, and then sort of build on this and say, okay, where do we go from here? And so it has both a sort of a sectoral angle of, if you're into disaster risk reduction, right, or if you are, and it has a geographic angle, right, so saying, okay, for this region, what does it exactly mean? What would that then entail for our security?
Great, thank you. I want to open for questions in just a minute, but Matt, I wanted to come back to you because I think there was a point that you wanted to take a minute to expand on in terms of maybe picking up on that thread about globalization. The way we're talking about it is very different now.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those comments about framing and how it's received and, explaining benefits in all of this really does resonate. I mean, it's publicly available that shortly after taking office, our current government did do a classified climate national security assessment. It's unrelated to this current one, but it has been done. So we are very clearly thinking of this issue through that lens. But the way that this current report was released in Australia, I think, is quite telling as well. So it was timed just before our 2035 emissions reduction target was released. So in the series of, so there was a week in September where on the Monday, the government released the National Climate Risk Assessment and then Adaptation Plan, and then on the Wednesday was the emissions reduction target, the Net Zero Plan, the sectoral reduction plans. So it was actually, I mean, you're all aware of our climate wars in Australia. This was the government very clearly making the case for why ambitious mitigation efforts were needed, and explaining to the country why they are taking this action. So I think that's just an interesting point to make. And then, Tony, on your point about the sort of economic case for this. I mean, if you read our NDC or you read our net zero plans, this is about the economic opportunities of the transition and Australia being well placed to seize them. I mean, that is unambiguous in those documents. So, you know, unambiguous. I mean, it is very clear that that is how the government is framing this issue for the Australian population. And then the point I wanted to make was just about the region. So, you know, we're at the start of this process domestically, but you know, we live in a part of the world where climate and security are inextricably linked. You have the Pacific and the Pacific Islands Forum recognizing climate change as the greatest security threat that they face. And that combination of regional vulnerability to climate change and the intensification of strategic competition is like absolutely driving our strategic thinking. And, you know, a strong, stable, resilient region is obviously in our interest, and one that is less resilient, more vulnerable to the risks of climate change, more vulnerable to the influence of outside parties is not in our interest. So strong climate action for us is not just the right thing to do, but it's, I mean, as the Prime Minister has said, it's the entry fee for talking to the region about, you know, other things which we care very deeply about. And these realities are just fundamentally reshaping many of our relationships. I mean, at the heart of, you know, a number of our Pacific relationships now is climate and security and bringing these things together. So I just wanted to flag that it is actually forcing us to think very innovatively about this stuff, not only from a financing perspective and increasing resilience and adaptation, but, you know, much more creatively. You know, some of you might have heard of the Australia-Tuvalu Fellow Pillar Union Treaty from a couple of years ago, which is the world's first climate mobility treaty, providing a pathway for mobility with dignity for people who are fleeing the impacts of climate change in Tuvalu to Australia. It commits Australia to invest very heavily in Tuvalu's resilience so that people can stay there should they want to. Now, in exchange, it provides security, you know, guarantees for Australia and our ability to exactly. But, you know, I think it is still significant because it's a small country using its strategic value to extract, you know, quite forward-leaning climate protections from a developed neighbour. So, you know, our region is forcing us to think creatively about these problems in a way that, you know, might have been unimaginable, you know, 5 years ago. So, yeah.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments in the room? Please. I'm going to make my way over. We'll take a few at a time and hear about some of the work being done in Belgium, too. Please.
Thanks. Perhaps more of a comment or a response to your challenge around proofing climate policies from politics. Thinking that perhaps it would be important for these kind of risk assessments to be done by the state rather than by the government of the day, and for the policies that emanate from them to be adopted by whole of parliament type of approaches rather than, again, the party in power. And I know there's been some attempts like that in some countries. I know in Norway, for instance, where some issues that are recognized as long-term problems, policies are developed with the largest majority of parties possible, making long-term commitments beyond a particular election cycle, because I think our democratic system also is vulnerable in terms of these rapid election cycles. So I think that's one approach to try and politics-proof some of these issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that we saw that thinking about sort of different kinds of sort of not multilaterals, but like, you know, state to state or the private sector participation. And in the US, we've seen some of the momentum maintained with those efforts. And I certainly don't want to inoculate against democracy.
I know. Sorry. I put it too Dutch refreshingly honest. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Like that. It's just the legitimate. I wanted to make the legitimacy
Well, yeah,
point,
yeah.
because there is a danger in, we know best, and then we put it in motion because there's some politics. But yeah, I get your point.
Well, there's a communications gap that we have, I think, so where people, but that's a whole we're not going to go down that thread. But I think that what people want is in line with what has been invested in, right? But it has not been communicated to them in that way, and the disinformation, sort of misinformation, has been created a counterpoint. Okay, I know there were other points in the room. Luke, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was going to say a few words about this Belgian climate risk assessment, but you will all see it on 6th of November. Have a careful look, and it should inspire for the recommendations, or it has recommendations already for the National Security Council that our center has been mandated to give to the National Security Council. But I want also, and then instead of going through all the 28 risks that we identified, we've been inspired by the EUCRA, the European Climate Risk Assessment. I think it's the first member state of the EU that actually uses that as a model. And we from Belgium would be happy that other member states would actually also do that, so we can have some comparability among the member states on what are actually the risks and how they differentiate between the member states. Then we saw the Australian one, which is really very inspiring because they went beyond a few systems that we haven't been looking at. We looked at the 5 that were in this European Climate Risk Assessment. And then, of course, the inspiration from Germany, where it's linked in immediately to the security external affairs world. And an extension from our assessment now will be actually inspired by the German one to be happening next year. But this one is now ready and has been looking at a lot of the cascading effects and has been looking at the costs of no adaptation, which is a different discussion than the cost of no mitigation. And that calculation is even difficult, because if you look at, I don't even want to say the percentage of the Belgian emissions globally, but the European ones, and the impact that we have on climate change as such, as EU, is limited. We have to be honest about that. It's just limited. It's also used as an argument against mitigation, of course, and we don't want that to happen. So we have to focus on all these co-benefits that were mentioned already. When we do mitigation in Europe, it's our international responsibility, but it's basically for the health benefits, for the competitiveness, for the innovation. But we alone will not stop the impact. So we are preparing for these impacts. France has done this with a plan for 3 degrees that is preparing not for the worst, but for a bad situation, honestly. And they're starting to do this now. So this is about making the case for investment in adaptation in different sectors. And an assessment, also like ours and like others, will have to continue to make that case that the sectors go at it, including the security sector. And we're back to the debate this morning in the first session, where defense spending, which is so massive or going to be massive now, can be used with the right recommendations to be spent in a dual use context, because as we all know, adaptation funding so far has been extremely marginal. And the last word on this is very surprising if you look at the alarm bells that the insurance sector is ringing, and still we are not massively investing in adaptation, which, by the way, and I'll try to conclude there, many of these investments are actually no-regret measures. So we don't even get to the no-regret measures. And I think through what we are doing now also in Belgium is try to work with the security network, and we have been invited to speak to the Joint Intelligence Committee at the Belgian level that prepares the National Security Council, that at least there is some understanding now on how they can translate into how this becomes a security issue. And it can be in many ways. It's our health system that will be under pressure. That is a security issue. Heat stresses, vector-borne diseases that will increase. The same goes for social cohesion. And this is a point where we talk about just transition a lot, which is fair and is also necessary. The just resilience part, so where you have to make your adaptation measures in the place where the people are most vulnerable, is something that is still very marginally touched upon. So these are a few of the things that come out of our assessment on recommendations that we hope that will also percolate outside of Belgium. But in the next phase, yeah, we want to be inspired by the German example and make sure that we add that bigger international dimension also.
Can you tell us where we can find the report on November 6th?
Everywhere. We will make sure you'll reach, it reaches you. It will be on our website, cerac.be, but we will share that widely, yeah.
That's great, okay, thank you. I think, please. Oh, sorry, there's 2 of you right next to each other, so
sorry.
you point to first.
Okay. Hi, Laura Schiffer with German Watch. So I have a question on the risk assessment, because also from civil society perspective, this is a really relevant document and also the set of actors is very crucial. But what we now see in Germany is that a National Security Council was set up without the environment minister being present or climate expertise being involved. And hence, I have a question on the communication gap, which you've already mentioned, because apparently there is a communication gap in how the relevance of this report and its insights are communicated to decision makers. And so I'm wondering if you have already next steps planned in how to communicate these results or even make more concrete policy recommendations out of it.
Take the question next to you as well, please.
Thank you. My name is Dorothea Ramkjær. I'm from Concito, a climate think tank located in Denmark. And a point of information and 2 questions. Basically, we are collaborating with adelphi and the German embassy in Copenhagen to try and inspire Danish stakeholders to do an assessment like the German one, exactly for all the reasons that have been laid out here. And in that endeavor, we are really believing it incredibly important to have input from German stakeholders so that the Danish peers can talk to, Danish and German peers can have a discussion between them. That was just a point of information. Then a question. One of the really inspiring things about the Nike is basically the notion of the need for interdisciplinary collaboration across the board. At the same time, when one looks at the EU and all the different plans, the Draghi report, the Minister report, the resilience plan, the adaptation plan, the preparedness plan, but exactly, and they're all good and nice. But when you step back a little bit, it's actually still siloed, as is exactly the case in Denmark. Well, there's so many plans that member states are required to implement. That is my question. Are we still siloed? And do we actually get to the point of applying a coherent strategy that will make life easier for the different stakeholders that all need to be engaged? That is one point. And the second question is actually, I think another important point in terms of the Nike is the realization that investments in livability in the global south, for instance, and is extremely important and directly impacting security in our part of the world. At the same time, we are seeing reductions in ODA across the board and climate finance. And it's just, if we want to build partnerships that are equal and respecting the challenges of others, I think that's a point to be taken into consideration.
Great, thank you. Maybe we take those together. So because in terms of your first question, I think it jives well with the previous question about silos, right? Like sort of even in the portfolios of people working on different aspects of foreign policy or environment or finance or health, right? How do you make sure that the reports and the plans, the assessments are reaching across? So we'll start with that one. And then the second question about the broader context of the reductions in support for humanitarian development assistance and how that might have repercussions for climate security investments. Who would like to kick us off? Tony.
Yeah, on all these EU plans. So first, I agree, there are a lot of EU plans and there's a lot more coming. I mean, it's... But what is important to also understand how the EU and the Commission in this case works. So the Commission has 27 commissioners who are dealing with agriculture, environment, climate, energy, all different things. But the decision making is collegial. That's one. Two, when I mentioned the preparedness strategy and the climate risk, it's not only collegial, but the premise of the strategy is across all sectors. So the premise is to break through these silos. Whether we're successful or not, that's a second thing, but that's really the premise. And from that emanates actions, law, regulations, which then have influence on action. And I think the good thing about it is that it has, as I like to say, it has to penetrate the DNA of our governance, because of course, it would be very aesthetic to have one plan that says all and solves all, but that's then a separate thing. We need to get it all through. So I think at a certain time, these things actually, you already see influence from these Draghi reports. Now, people say it's not enough, but things are finding their way in. So, and we need these inspirational like this and other documents to push the politicians who then ask the services to come up. Yeah, I can't make it any better than that. And at some other time, I still want to come back because I feel very bad about what I said. But I'll do that at the end.
I mean, that's fine. You don't need to feel bad.
Yeah, I just assumed. Okay, now you.
Now me. Yeah, I think to your point about the silos, I think one point is there's so much talk about breaking the silos, and I'm not convinced that's the way forward. I think the silos are also an expression of brokers, of specialization, of people really knowing what they're doing, right? So I don't think the silos are the problem. The problem is the lack of bridges between the silos, right? So the fact that people work on their specific issue, but they don't dare or don't care to sort of look at the bigger picture issues, right? And so what ideally I could imagine is that that all policymaking goes through some sort of mental process where we check what is this policy, how is this policy impacting the fundamentals of our security, right? And including the impacts on a global climate system, right? So in Germany, when the cabinet takes a decision, there's always two sentences in the decision. First is the decision, and the second sentence is, what will it do to inflation? It's our national trauma, so that's what we talk about, even if it's about, like, do we send a police officer to Georgia? So what's the impact on inflation? But what it should be, like that one question that you should always ask, so what does it actually mean, right, for the biggest global public goods that we want to achieve, right? But of course, just that we want to pursue peace and planetary security needs to be translated down quite a bit for sort of in each policy field, and sort of it's about making that connection. So really focusing on how do we improve disaster response, but with a view to, like, sort of are we not contributing negatively to any other of the overarching objectives. And so if there's now a huge investment in defense in Europe, can we make sure that we don't at the same time undo this, e.g. by funding the aggressor or continuing to fund the aggressor, right? And sort of that should be in my view, the way that we can sort of try to connect silos, but keep the good things about silos. Maybe not silos.
Did either of you want to chime in? Okay.
Well, just a brief comment. First of all, I agree there's a reason why there are silos, because it's part of the division of labor, and maybe people don't care or dare, as you put it, but maybe they are not tasked either. In particular, the bureaucracy, they receive some instructions from above, from politically legitimized leaders, and in a way the National Security Council is exactly that, to try to bridge the silos and task the different ministries to work on joint projects. Yes, and to the other question, well, it's an experiment in a way. It's the first time we're setting up such a structure, and there has been a reason why it's taken so long in the history of the Federal Republic for this to come about. So maybe it makes sense to not overburden it with too complicated a structure. I know the Ministry of Environment is not a permanent member, but that doesn't mean it is not a member at all. I mean, depending on the subject matter at hand, either other government structures or experts can be called into the council or be part of the deliberation. So what you sometimes read, that climate would not be part of it, that's simply not true. I mean, the agenda has to be defined. It will be defined depending on the necessities, and it might well be. And after all, the Foreign Office is a permanent member, and as you heard the State Secretary explain, climate is definitely part of our portfolio, climate foreign policy, so I wouldn't be too pessimistic just as it is outlined now. It needs to come into being, that's important, and then I'm sure it will develop.
Thank you. I know how important the coffee break is, so I think we have time for one more round of questions or comments, and then I can give you all the final word if you're up for it. Please, in the back there.
Hi, Efren Gomez, I'm from WWF. Thanks so much. Sorry I was a bit late. I think it's interesting to have this discussion because I think from WWF we come from the world of conservation, right? And we've always valued peace, but we're understanding more and more about security all the way up to defense, right? It's a bit beyond our traditional comfort zone, which is an environmental feasibility, where we're discovering that, right? For instance, in the NATO context. And similarly, we also note sort of a general intention of valuing nature more, right? Whether it's in economics, trade, commerce, right? And here we also have the defense sector. Maybe politics is the one that needs to catch up a bit. But my question is about one of the principles that we have when we engage in this. And it's about the co-creation and the inclusion, you know? And so so it's an open question to panelists and maybe to others also here. I think we heard something in the plenary to this effect too, is of course, how do we work with the communities that are affected? And I'm saying this, it's a bit self-interest, you know, because we're a large conservation organization, and it's something that it's something that is important for us for the sustainability of our efforts, right? Whether it's parliamentary across the aisle or whatever, but it's also about those on the front lines and the whole of society effort that we need to compass, you know. What is your experience around this? What are the opportunities that you see, in that approach?
Thank you. Any other burning questions? Please.
Thank you very much. My name is adelphi, and I work at the German Council of Foreign Relations. This is a reformulation of a question I found really important on financing of climate action, and we see that there is more cut or not really rising finance for climate action, but there is a lot of appetite for spending on security, defense. But I'm really glad that there's a consensus across the panel that security risks can originate elsewhere in other sectors, outside or beyond your borders. So there is this agreement here. Can this panel, especially those of you representing or working in the government, maybe make a case for spending on climate from the security budgets? Because it's quite clear that other areas and sectors can cause security risks when there is really a limited budget for climate action.
Thank you. Okay, so two questions, and then any sort of final remarks you have. One on how we work with affected communities to ensure that their perspectives of both sort of risks but also resilience, right? Where can investments be made, be integrated into these types of assessments? And then the second question on financing and recognizing that other budgets might be more robust and can help offset some of the security risks of climate. Who would like to start? Matt, take it away.
Yeah. I mean, the point about inclusion is a really, really interesting one. So, I mean, just from our experience doing the risk assessment, a central part of that was, a finding and a recognition that remote local communities, First Nations communities, are actually going to be, disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, which the risk assessment is finding. So, when we were doing the risk assessment, there was a tailored, longer, more local approach to collecting information and data with First Nations and regional communities. And the National Adaptation Plan similarly sets out that the response to a lot of these risks has to be locally led and managed. So, that is a work in progress, but our risk assessment and the adaptation plan absolutely recognise, the thrust of your question is correct. And on financing, I think there's a link to that. I mean, Australia, I think, is very cognizant of the fact that, climate financing abroad has to be locally led and has to be regionally led and has to respond to community needs. So, you know, much of our climate financing is locally led adaptation and resilience financing. I mean, the point about taking money from defence to fund climate, I'm all for that, but I'm not sure my defence colleagues will be. But, you know, that's not something, we are not cutting our climate financing. That's not what we're doing. I might just stop there in the interest of time, but the essence of your question is right. I mean, if we're taking a very broad view of climate risk, is climate financing the only pool of money we should be accessing to do it? I think that's quite a thought-provoking question.
Thank you. Any final comments?
Yes, happy to do that. I can subscribe to basically everything my colleagues said. I think it's very important to include the local perspective. First of all, when it comes to the analysis and the assessment of the situation, and then, of course, also when it comes to implementation of whatever action you take in order to make it sustainable, not only in the environmental sense, but in order to make it effective and long-lasting. And, of course, indigenous communities play a significant role, but basically that has to do with all other communities as well. If it's supposed to not just be a brief, fireworks of money spent, but to have a lasting impact to turn things around, then you need to have local ownership. Of course, that's not always a given. It's a challenge, but it is usually something that we want to include into our thinking, into our action. And as to your point, yes, it's sometimes easily made, that trade-off, either we spend on defense or we spend on other things such as climate actions, and we know each euro, each dollar can be spent only once. So the way to go is, in particular, as we are in a way obliged or forced to increase our defense spending, given the security situation, the behavior of certain countries, we have to make sure to create the largest amount of synergies. Of course, defense spending sometimes means improving certain infrastructures, and then do it, that's also in a way part of adaptation, or do it in an environmentally sustainable way. That's, not always easy, but certainly it needs to be done. And then we should not forget, climate finance is not and cannot be only public money. It's about leveraging private money. All those numbers that have been talked about or agreed upon at COP, it needs the private sector. And so maybe we can get out of this dichotomy, either defense spending or else, by being more successful in that regard.
Thank you. Ben?
Maybe one last final thought is on that, what I sometimes see as another of the false choices, right? That is being articulated these days, of the sort of, we need, and there are good reasons, we need to increase our defense spending. Therefore, all other international spending has to go down, right? Why is that, right? If we are faced with a sort of greater international uncertainty against which we seek security, then we have to address all the sources of that insecurity, and that means, yes, greater defense spending, but it also means, on top of that, greater spending on diplomacy and development. Of course, that will mean that somewhere else, there will need to be cuts, but it's the same impulse of protection to which it corresponds, and it goes back to Luke's point about sort of, no, we cannot just by ourselves guarantee a good outcome if we are responsible for 6% of the emissions as the EU. But it doesn't mean that it's negligible. It just means we also have to think about the other 94% in our own interest, right? And that will mean we will need to invest into that as well. So I don't think that choice of, we have a certain pot of money that's for international things, and it needs to, all of it needs to in defense, so sorry, nothing left for the rest, is one that actually expresses our enlightened self-interest.
Final word.
Yeah, because I think the minute is over. So, a very blunt answer to your question, can we put defense money into climate finance with that label? Answer, no. I just don't think that's viable. At the moment, the reason why we have to go into this defense spending is because of the geopolitical risks that are there. And I think if we start the argument with the way you said, however much I may agree with the premise, we lose the argument. However, what has been said by a number of people around here, and we've been talking about all day, if you go for an effective military, that means it has to be resilient, and it has to be innovative, and that means it will be competitive. And the dual-use technologies and the wins that might have quicker cycles because of that defense spending, then will have to find their way not only to your citizens back home, but also in the deployment abroad, which helps resilience and might help innovation and might help vulnerable countries leapfrog stages that otherwise they would have to go through because that innovation wasn't there. But I'm just trying to be honest. I think if you say, let's use that big defense money and put a sticker climate spending on, it's not going to work. However, the good news is that this week the numbers will come out of what the EU plus member states financing is for this year. They're going to be good numbers. And I think so far, and I say it's not a beauty contest, and the world's ODA is going down and one big state moved out. But the EU and the member states are the biggest global donor, and as far as I can see, we're going to remain that. So we put money where our mouth is. And if you allow me that final, because I felt bad, but perhaps because the question triggered something in me. We're talking about disinformation. Often the accusation is made that bureaucrats and the deep state is trying to put together some certain policy, and so to combat that, my instinctive response or reaction is I want to be as transparent as possible, and it is so important constantly and it's a more difficult job, engage our constituents, the citizens, so that they agree, because that word legitimacy is so crucial, and there are forces out there that will use lies and disinformation to break that narrative, and so we have a more difficult job, but we have to fight back with transparency, with facts, and democracy, however fragile that is.
Great note to end on. Thank you all for staying with us and for being part of the discussion. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.